We're thrilled to have Penny Smallacombe joining us, and who's going to be in conversation with Rhoda Roberts. I'll let Rhoda actually introduce Penny, but I'd love to introduce you to Rhoda Roberts. Rhoda is a Widjabul Waiable woman from the local Bundjalung territories. She's one of Australia's most experienced and motivated and versatile arts executives working in our industry. Up until a couple of weeks ago, Rhoda was working as the head of First Nations programming at the Sydney Opera House, where she's now leaving behind what can only be described as an incredible legacy. Rhoda is also the creative director of the Parrtjima Festival in Alice Springs, which, if you don't know about that festival, get on Google and have a look, because it's one of the most amazing festivals that I've ever seen, and it is certainly on my bucket list. Rhoda has achieved so much in her career so far, and I'm so particularly thrilled to have her as a board member of Screenworks. And for now, I'm going to move off the stage and hand it over to Rhoda to introduce this session. So thank you and welcome. I'm so excited about this session. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ken. The amazing Ken Crouch, who also lives on Bundjalung territories, just around the corner from me, in fact, sort of. Hi, everyone. I'm Rhoda, and thank you. That was a really lovely introduction. I want to say a big thank you to my sister for that lovely welcome this morning on these lands of our estates, which go from the lower Clarence River to north to the Logan River and west to the Great Dividing Range. And our nation is an extraordinary one to belong to. And as I was hearing what Lois was saying about the stories and the first Wanderall here, it made me think of the women that play such an important role in our lives. But in fact, those early women, our ancestors, which I believe we walk daily with. And when I think of our story of country and our three brothers, I always think of the women and their voices on the wind, because it was flat water until that day she had to call out to her sons and called on her sisters, the wind. And so the waves were created on the east coast. And then I think of those waterways and that sky country that we gaze at every night, which takes us to the songlines in the heavens, but also reminds us of what we have on the ground and those trade routes and songlines that we travelled for so many years to Penny's country. And could you just tell us a little bit, Penny Smallacombe, working at Screen Australia and done some extraordinary things, but I think it was the women behind you too that helped shape you. But I'd just love you if you could just describe your country as well, because I know it's not as good as this one, but you know, you can't have.
We're going to have a little country off. No, thank you very much, Rhoda, and also congratulations on the amazing 11 years that you're at the Opera House. You know, what a legacy to leave behind. I'm a Maramanindji woman from the Daly River region of the Northern Territory, so it's probably just 3 hours southwest of Darwin. It's hot, beautiful, tropical country. And so who doesn't love tropical country? There's no winter where I come from, so that's a good thing. But it is beautiful, beautiful spring country, beautiful hills, and of course the mighty Daly River, which is our, it's probably the most important part of the lifestyle and where I sort of grew up and where I caught my first fish and where I fought a croc for my first fish, actually. I do remember. It's sort of crocodile-infested waters. But it is beautiful country, and unfortunately because of COVID, I really haven't had a chance to go back there. So I am longing to return. And I come from amazing women. My great-great-grandmother, she was taken as a 6-year-old and sent to Tipperary Station to work in the house. So she was working pretty much as a servant from the time she was 6. She had lighter skin because her father was Chinese and her mother was Aboriginal. My nana was born on the cattle station, Tipperary Station. Her name was Rita. And she met and married my grandfather, her husband, on the station, as they both worked there together, and his name was Major. So, and then right through to my mum, who is the eldest of 11. So it is very strong sort of women all being the eldest in their family, and then me, the only child. Obviously, I think Mum said she had, being the eldest of 11, by the time I came around, she didn't want any more children. So fair enough.
But she had you.
She did. She had me. And also, you know, I remember Rhoda and I were having some conversations last night back at the resort. Some of you might have been privileged enough to overhear those. But we were talking about when I first arrived in Sydney and I was working for the ABC. I met Rhoda when I was 21 years of age, and of course we were hanging out, I think, at the Bourbon and Beefsteak or something like that, when it was the Bourbon and Beefsteak, and it was fun back then. But I've had a real privilege of knowing Rhoda for 20 years and always been inspired by everything you do and the legacy and your tremendous networks and really hard work for Indigenous people.
Thank you, darling, and welcome. Jingi Walla Widaware Jugum Bunjalung. And I'm Widjable, so I'm the next clan group over. But we all have family affiliations across these estates. It is so wonderful to be here. And this conference is titled Regional to Global. And I'm reminded every time we talk about the work we do, that there's always been those pioneers that went before us who did extraordinary work. And I think that's what happens, and all the mob in the room will totally get this. You know, the grass might grow back and you make that path again for the next generation to come and tread that path. And that's just a continuous cycle. And when I think of regional to global, well, hell, we've been doing that for over 40 years. And I'm reminded of when I was working in television and the extraordinary paths that were being stomped at that time. One with the ABC, I have to mention a great Bunjalung man, the late Uncle Lester Bostock, who was possibly one of the first working in television at the time when SBS was started. He set up a unit and he developed protocols about working with Aboriginal First Nations peoples. But then there was this extraordinary history, because when we think regional to global, geez, for the last 5 years at least, I've seen people on the red carpet at Cannes. And we're so, so proud of that our voice is heard on an international platform. And Penny, I'd love to just, if you could, you know, working at Screen Australia, but you've worked at numerous places, and from the ABC to what was then the AFC and all the configurations in between, can you just touch on that extraordinary history? I guess when the AFC platform was set up through Wal Saunders, and we just started to see all these short films being developed, and it was the mentoring of that next generation.
Yeah, look, you know, working in Screen Australia, people sort of say, you know, why, you know, such a small population and even still a smaller group of filmmakers, why are there so many success stories? You know, why is there things like Sweet Country or Total Control or Mystery Road, and why are they some of the most outstanding drama that's being produced in this country, and also with the feature films in terms of how they're being received internationally. And really, it's been long-term sustained investment in people and in filmmakers, and certainly this, and it's kicked off even way before that, but I'll only sort of talk from what I know about where it all started at the AFC. And there were, of course, at that time, it was very difficult, and there were very few Indigenous people being funded. Through the AFC, there was still a huge amount of content being made about First Nations people. Most of that content was being made with very little collaboration, with very little consultation. And from that came Wal Saunders, who actually started the first Indigenous department at the AFC at the time. When Wal started 27 years ago, it was just him, no budget, no money, no nothing. It's just like, Wal, create strategies, develop this, find talent, do all of this. And Wal is a fabulous man, a fabulous character, of course, so he sort of got in there and just started to steal little buckets of money from all the little areas, you know, from the documentary area and from this area. And from that, he kind of knew that the beginning of it all would be to work with a group of filmmakers just to make some short films and not just do workshops for workshop's sake. I mean, I'm sure as practitioners, we've all been to about 1 million labs and 1 million different workshops, but unless you have a production outcome, and a credit, it is very hard to kind of get to the next stage of your sort of filmmaking career. So he knew this very, very well. And in the first sort of 5 or 6 years of his time at the AFC, that's all they did. You know, they did these amazing labs, short films, which included, Warwick Thornton was in the very first round with a fabulous, fabulous film. I can't remember. Oh God, was it called? Protected. It'll come to me. Sorry, the title I've forgotten. Darlene Johnson was in there. Ivan Sen was in, I think, the second category. Rachel Perkins produced one of the films. You know, so it was just a really beautiful small group of people, very intimate kind of setting, while also brought in the best of the best. You know, he had Philip Noyce, he had Baz Luhrmann, he had these kind of people mentoring and developing and working on story with our Indigenous filmmakers. And from that, and also many other things that were happening at the time, Lester Bostock had started a scholarship scheme at the Australian Television Radio Film School. The ABC had an Indigenous unit making various programs. SBS was making ICAM, and Karma in Central Australia was developing content as well, making Nunapa stories, making language-based stories. So all of this kind of converged, I think, at around the same time. And 27 years later, the fruits of that labour and that direct investment in talent and in their stories has prevailed. And I personally think some of the stuff that we've funded over the last 6.5 years, and even before that, is some of the best content, and it is being received really, really well. Even Mystery Road winning a Logie in terms of which is quite surprising in terms of that popular vote. I think these are really great times. At the same time, I think when Rachel Perkins was told at the ABC, maybe about 15 years ago, that there will never be an Australian Indigenous scripted show in primetime drama slot in the ABC because there's not an audience for it, no one cares. The switch-off value for Indigenous storytelling means that they lose about 200,000 in terms of ratings. And they were doing that in terms of news and current affairs stories. The ratings always dropped by 200,000 when there was something First Nations focused. So there was this broad belief that there was no room for First Nations stories in primetime slots. And last year and the year before, we had Total Control and Mystery Road, which were the most popular programs, besides children's, of course. You can't beat Kids and Bluey. That's just, the truth. But, in the country. So, times have changed, but it's been a battle for people to get there. And also, they're tremendously talented people with such significantly important stories to tell. And I think we've just seen it flourish over the years, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it has flourished. I mean, there's a huge groundswell, but we're also seeing a shift in the way we approach the filmmaking, in the way that we work with our allies. But also it brings up a lot of, uncomfortable conversations we sometimes have to have with those allies. And that's the shift we're also seeing, that there is starting to have a value. People are starting to value Aboriginal people as the first peoples of this country. And we never thought that would be possible because we live under a system where we've seen the kidnappings consistently. We live under a system that I often go, gee, if I was to say to someone what it's like to live in and work in an environment of degradation, dehumanisation, disenfranchising, just consistent, there you are of no value. You would almost think it was some form of domestic abuse. And so this country is still sitting right on that crest of the wave where if we don't have the conversation now and work out the ground rules, because no longer can we just be taken for granted. We have a currency and a value, and that needs to be discussed, and people need to be open. Because if we don't, we're on that crest of that wave and we're going to be dumped, and very severely. So that's my introduction to the next question to Penny is they are uncomfortable conversations we often have, and often there is a defensiveness from the perpetrators of why we have to have this conversation. I don't mean individual people when I talk about perpetrators, but I'm talking about government policy and the language that is used about First Nations work. You know, the almost, oh, we have to have this, we have to tick the box. We need to move away from that, and that working in collaboration is the big discussion. I know you've been, for the last 6 years at Screen Australia, you've developed some protocols and pathways and addressing some of those issues that we as First Peoples working in the industry consistently face.
Yeah, the pathways and protocols document in terms of how you work with First Nations people, obviously, to tell screen stories was developed before my time with Sally Riley, Erica Glynn, and of course Terry Janke. And I mean, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. When I spoke to Sally Riley about the development of these protocols, she said, well, we just had to do it. There were so many non-Indigenous people wanting to tell Indigenous stories. You know, some were smaller aspects. They might be doing a documentary about, you know, diabetes, and of course they're going to touch on Indigenous stories. Like they have to. You'd be silly if you didn't. They have to include those kind of stories. But then there were bigger films that were being made by non-Indigenous writers and directors with major Indigenous themes or historical storytellings and retellings of real events in real times. And so Sally said that they're coming, you know, these things, people want to make Indigenous content. They don't know how to do it properly. On the other side of the coin, when I spoke to Erica Glynn, I loved it. She just sort of said, fucking hell, have we just given them the keys to the kingdom, and then we've just told them exactly what to do and how to make our stories. So, you know, it is a bit of a double-edged sword in terms of how much information we provide, in terms of how much we work together. You know, the Sapphires and Brand New Day, I think, showed that there is commercial viability in First Nation stories, both locally and globally. And, you know, we're all trying to make films that, you know, speak to audiences and hopefully get some box office. You know, we're getting, you know, The Dry right now is doing has done fantastic. We're really having a little boom in the box office right now. And we want to make films that are successful in that way. Otherwise, you know, what are we doing here? I guess for us, the conversation has always been about filmmaking is a team sport. We're always going to have allies. We're always going to collaborate with non-Indigenous people. For us, and the vast majority of filmmakers that I know have great working relationships and collaborate with the producers that they want, regardless of if they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. But there is a real wave of misunderstanding and a real wave of people that I think still don't understand and don't get the fact that the vast majority of screen content that has ever been made about First Nations people has been made by non-Indigenous people. Some of this earlier content has really, I can't even say the word, has really created misunderstandings of who we are. It's created massive problems within our communities, and it also has kind of led to, you know, like Australia's kind of, it's added to Australia's, you know, problems with Indigenous people and sort of outright racism. So my feeling and what I always talk about is allow us an opportunity to rebalance the scales, you know, allow us an opportunity to make stories about ourselves, for you and for our global audiences, so we can rebalance the scales and people can have a better understanding of our point of view in the world. And that doesn't mean that people can't work collaboratively and beautifully. I'd like to acknowledge Lois Randall, that's sitting right in front of me, made a fantastic children's series called Grace Beside Me with another Indigenous producer, Dina Curtis, based on a book by Sue McPherson, who was also a writer on it. There are amazing collaborations that take place and that do it well, and you can tell by the content that it's been authentically made, it's been done in a collaborative way, and we've got an insight into a world that we haven't seen, which, you know, is a beautiful family living in regional New South Wales, you know, and a bunch of kids having a great time. So there are certainly ways that it can be done properly. I think at the end of the day that if you want to work with Indigenous people and you want to collaborate, you have to ask yourself whether you're possibly going to be profiting from trauma. You know, if you're possibly going to be making a career of telling a story that was about an injustice, and what does that mean? You know, because at the end of the day, it sounds terrible, but surely as Indigenous people, we could probably try and make a profit from our own trauma in terms of the stories that we need to tell. At a very, you know, surely that might be something that belongs to us. You know, it's funny when I do these conversations and we talk about sort of the politics of representation and collaboration versus consultation. We will have these conversations. I'll walk off the stage and a non-Indigenous person will come straight up to me and say, "Oh, you're not going to like it, Penny, but, you know, I want to tell you about my Aboriginal story." And I'm like, "Oh, here we go, your Aboriginal story. Excellent." So, you know, I'm not sure why people don't get it. I'm not sure why people don't understand, but, you know, we need the space to be able to tell our stories. We need the space to be able to figure out when a story needs to be told. There's also a Western sense of urgency about, no, I found out about this massacre a couple of years ago. Everyone in the world needs to know this took place. They need to know it now. And it's like, well, maybe someone from that community hasn't gone to film school yet, and maybe they're not old enough to make that about their own people and their own family yet. And you're also taking the marketplace away, because it's very, very hard to make another film on similar subject matter when we've got an international marketplace dictating to us as well about films. You know, for instance, Rabbit Fence don't get me wrong, is a great film. Philip Noyce is a great collaborator with First Nations people. But how many Stolen Generation films have you seen since then? Once the marketplace is gone, once that's out there, it's very hard to pitch another story where people are like, oh, but Rabbit Fence has been done, so you don't need to make another Stolen Gen story, you know? So I think people need to be really cognizant of that as well. But look, I feel like I'm being a Debbie Downer and a negative Nancy here, so ask me a positive question.
Yes. Thank you, Penny. And you're not a Debbie Downer. And we're just too strong for you, Karen. But I've actually got the T-shirt. It's fabulous. But just touching on the consultancy and the collaboration, and you know, and mentioning Lois Randall, it's quite interesting. Lois has worked for many, many years in the film industry, but also for many, many years has worked with Aboriginal people. And I think one of the keys, and you possibly can correct me, but watching the way you work, Lois understands that silence is also a language. So when you ask someone a question about a film you want to make and you're trying to be very culturally observant and respectful, there's a difference between competency and consciousness. And so I would suggest that Lois comes from a background of having cultural consciousness. So she doesn't just keep asking the question, she waits, because they are observing and reading her to see if she's open enough and is listening, deeply listening. And it always reminds me of the way that we are guided by those before us, or when knowledge is passed on. There's never a wrong question. Yes, we make mistakes and we do big fuck-ups, but that's okay, because that's the only way that our people think about the learnings that we will share then with the next moment when it's happening. But I always think of the way they pass on dance. And I think this is how Lois, in a sort of metaphor, works with, particularly around our region and some of our great filmmakers in this region like John Bell. When you go as a young man to learn a particular dance, there's a rhythm and the way that you use your arms. But it's never taught because we don't have those sorts of dance schools as such. And it's been outlawed for so long that now, on that crest of the wave, we're able to reactivate our languages. The dance that has been sleeping is now being awoken. And I had the wonderful pleasure, I'm just so blessed, to watch an old man pass dance. So he starts with the rhythm and the silence, and he places the young boy's hand on his elbow, because the dance is a bit like, you know, touching your tummy and your thing, and he moves, and the boy's arm moves, And he just keeps doing that until that rhythm is met. And then they dance together. And I think that's a little bit about how Lois, when she's making those films, she's got knowledge as a filmmaker and a producer. And she's bringing these other ones, and it's the side-by-side learning. And that's collaboration, and that's true cultural consciousness. And just touching on that, I mean, it is a hard one because, as you say, there are so many stories, and often the stories can trigger trauma. If we were to have an ideal world, what would be the approach of, say, you know, the white dusty male comes up and says, but I've got an Aboriginal story. What would be the perfect scenario of making sure that that could be a really good story? But how do you engage to say, actually, the story needs to be told through this other narrative?
Yeah, no, look, it is an interesting question. I think I was having a chat with just a couple of weeks ago a great writer in Stephen McGregor who told me about an idea that was actually given to him from a non-Indigenous producer, and it is a great story too. And he just sort of said, "Look, you know, I'm not sure if it's the right time for me to make something like this. I certainly wouldn't make it without you, Stephen. But boom, here, have a think about this story. Maybe you can share it amongst the First Nations filmmaking community and see if anyone wants to do any more research or wants to run with that story." So obviously, maybe just hand it over, but you know, that's you're probably bringing your expertise and your local knowledge to it. It can be done. You know, collaboration is fraught with a lot of mistakes. Consultation is fraught with a lot of mistakes. Every wrong move you make, every person you upset along the way, every assumption you make can go wrong or can go incredibly right. You have to start with a conversation, first and foremost. First Nations people, we're humans, you know. If you know, have this great idea or something that's localized in your region, I'm sure you're all people living in the region. I'm sure you're all interacting with First Nations people often. I'm sure you've got your own fabulous tight relationships with First Nations people that may want to really work with you to tell their story because they trust you, and I think that that's great. With everything, there's no one overarching guide of what to do. Every story comes into fruition through its own pathway. So there's no one answer of how it's done appropriately. It's about conversations. It's about talking locally to the First Nations people you have. It's about specificity, but it's also about including and bringing on people that have industry knowledge, First Nations people with industry knowledge. So often where I see where things go wrong is where someone is using a local Indigenous consultant, and they are, they are advising, but often they are not aware of production development funds, times restraints, deadlines, deliveries, all of the production, and post-production, or right through to the very end of delivery, and then right through beyond that. So I think that when you want to do it and you want to collaborate, you need both. You need your localised person that has the knowledge, that is the cultural authority for that story, that land, that place, that tree, whatever it is, as well as you need to include people that have production knowledge and methodologies to be able to work in tandem. Rhoda and I were talking about everything in Australia, in Indigenous, everything in Australia is done in a way through many clans, and I won't say all of Australia, but majority. If there's a mountain, you'll have both a manager for the mountain and an actual owner for the mountain, and the traditional owner that speaks for it is integral to the process, but the manager is the one that negotiates relationships with people about maybe that songs need to be sung at a certain time of year or whatever cultural practices need to take place to maintain the site and speaking to country. So I think that when you approach filmmaking, you should think of it very much in the same way, that you need an owner and you need a manager, and you need to figure out how that relationship works with that story and that place. And that's both your local cultural person that has the cultural authority, but also your First Nations filmmaking team that you're going to surround yourself with. And another thing that I will say is it's not an obstacle to making your film better by going out and actually finding people to collaborate with. And you're going to get a lot of knockbacks from a lot of First Nations people. They're going to say, no, I'm making my own stories right now. I'm not interested in working on your project. But you will find the right people if this story is meant to be told, and it will happen. But, you know, it has to happen. I always say things have to happen when they're ready. You know, the story comes into fruition when it's ready and when the time is right. So, you know, I'm not saying don't tell Indigenous stories full stop. I would say step back and really think about, should you be telling this story? Are you the right person? Is there another Indigenous person in 6 months, 12 years, 20 years that's going to be actually better to tell this story? These are the important questions that you ask. I think there's interesting developments when we're looking at scripted series now, and we're having really amazing story rooms, you know, that it can be, I've seen some great inclusivity that's both First Nations, kind of emerging writers possibly, and then some really super experienced, you know, writers in rooms working in really beautiful collaborative ways. TV is scripted series and TV is much faster to turn around than the lifeline of a feature film. So, you know, there's many different ways to do it, but like with everything that you approach and with every story, you have to think that, you know, it's a privilege and it's not just your right to tell that story, and how you approach it must be done with great, you know, courtesy. You'd be surprised how rude people are in terms of, I sent you my script and you haven't read it and you haven't given me notes yet. And I'm like, well, I don't really care for your story. It's not your story, and why do I have to take time out of my busy day to read your script? So, you know, be polite. Be surprised how many rude people I encounter.
I can imagine you encounter a lot of rude people. And I'm listening to you and I'm shaking my head going, wow, you know, it's just incredible where we are. And there's great optimism. But I think when we think of regional to global, I also think of those incredible networks we have around the world, and I'd love you to touch on those. But I also want to say, when we're looking at films, we immediately go to who's in front of the camera, who's behind the camera, who's writing it, etc. But as we know, and particularly in our region at the moment, we are so blessed that there are so many films being made. And indeed, you know, in Sydney as well with Thor. So it doesn't just have to be having an engagement with us when it's an Aboriginal film. Wouldn't it be an ideal world that when you're working in a regional area, you employ locally? So, you know, the catering is done by a First Nations company just because they do great food. You know, the set is being assisted and mentored by including our young men and women who are at TAFE doing carpentry. I would think the ideal world for me would be, it doesn't matter what the film is, engage us so that we do lead this world into a tomorrow where there is unification. So, you know, if we can apply the practices of how we work, and I think Penny touched on it, but we always use our kinship systems to sort of help guide us a little bit of how we work in the Western canon, so to speak. And I think it becomes even more clearer when we're travelling overseas and we're meeting our international colleagues who are very much in the same boat as us, and they too implement their circles or the way that they construct and have constructed their lives forever. And so looking at those kinship ways and then travelling overseas with product and those engagements that we were having 30, 40 years ago with places like Canada, America, you know, Sundance, Imaginative, New Zealand, of course. Can you touch on some of those and what that dialogue, how that dialogue amongst First Nations filmmakers worldwide is happening?
Yeah, look, globally, it's extremely exciting. You know, really. You know, having Taika win an Oscar is fantastic, and through his company, Peaky Films, I mean, he's, you know, working to develop First Nations content in several countries around the world. He is working with Sterling Harjo who's a Native American, to make a fantastic series. He's working with people in Australia. He's working with the Sami, you know, who are across Norway, Finland, Sweden, and all of that Arctic area. And these conversations have been happening for well over 40 years, you know, during some very early Sundance labs that I think that Warwick Thornton, Tyker, and several other people were a part of. Certainly we have great interactions with, you know, I work through Screen Australia. I spend a lot of time talking to the New Zealand Film Commission, who now have a Māori First Nations department and a separate budget. And Canada has also established the Indigenous Screen Office there, who have put in actually a massive pitch for some money, and word on the street is they will probably get it and be the most well-funded Indigenous Screen Office in the world, which I think is going to be fantastic, and it's really going to boost everything that's happening over there. So there are a lot of global conversations, and I think we're moments away from really fantastic international co-pros where you're going to see, you know, Aboriginal Canadians and Aboriginal Australians working to create things. Certainly we're already working with the Māori on those, and we're moments away from having, you know, something hopefully fabulous like The Bridge, that we can call it The Ditch or something. But, you know, those are moments away, and there's a lot of shared storytelling. We also share with each other, like, the difficulties as well, you know. I think something that's coming up, and I think you'll all find it when you start sort of developing your bigger concepts and you need more money and you've got to find international financing, where we're trying to tell Indigenous stories, and often you're requested to have marquee cast. You know, you need a bankable name in your show, in your series, and sometimes it's a really difficult thing to be in when it's an Indigenous series or an Indigenous film, and suddenly as a requirement of funding and you need a name that audiences are going to know and come to find that content. So you're finding, you know, that we're getting this large non-Indigenous character that's got the name, that is the marquee cast, and how do they fit in with this Indigenous story? Are we planting them in there just to get the funding and the financing of the story? Because when that happens, it falls apart and you can tell it miserably. Or are we developing stories with these kind of things in mind from the get-go? And we will create that, you know, non-Indigenous evil character that can be played by Nicole Kidman or whatever it is, and then we'll get the financing to make our stories. So on a global scale, there are some really fascinating conversations about how our stories are changing to incorporate international financing structures, broadcaster requirements, all of those levels of financing that is needed to make a film. I'm leaving Screen Australia in June and going off to work on some projects, and it's funny how the tides change, because already I'm like, Jesus Christ, everything's so underfunded in this country, and I've been working at a funding body for years. So, you know, you start to really see the other side when you know that you're walking out the door. But the international collaborations will continue. I think that it's taken Australia a really long time to catch up to the international recognition that we've been getting for First Nations films for years, you know? Why was Samson and Delilah more popular and win more awards? And also Sweet Country sold to like more territories than any other feature film in the last, you know, 5 years. Territories that haven't bought an Australian film in a very, very long time. And then here it does a smaller box office, you know, and it wins a special jury prize at Venice. So I think that we're in a cultural shift right now, which is very exciting. Audiences are now excited about First Nations content. I think maybe the Australian cultural cringe might be slowly dying, is my feeling, which is super exciting. We're in a screen boom because of COVID. You know, there's every bloody Hollywood rock star in the world is on their way here. You've got massive productions taking place. We're all fighting over crews. Crews are winning right now. They haven't had a pay rise in a very long time, and they didn't have 12 months worth of work as well. So, you know, they are being nabbed up by every international production. It's also making local productions very stressed. How do we afford crews? How do we compete with big Netflix productions and Marvel film productions? So it's a difficult time, but it's an exciting time, you know. There's a mini boom going on right now. And I think that, you know, one of the big questions is, like, how do we capitalise from this mini boom? I think we're going to see this a tremendous thing of crews coming through. I can name like the best line producers in the country right now, and we're about to meet the next load that are going to come up from being production managers to line producers, which is very exciting, and coordinators to the next. So this is all great times. How do you, as writers, directors, and producers, capitalise? I don't know. I mean, Zac Efron is suddenly appearing in every Australian TV series and film taking place right now. Why not? He's bought a house. He's a local. He's been adopted. I'll have to give him a skin name eventually.
Geez, we should have got that land tax thing into budgets before they got here.
But it could be a missed opportunity, this boom, and that's a real shame, in terms of what money could be coming through, and not a couple of measly little jobs, working in the, driving around rock stars, but rather than, I think it would have been great if we were getting a little bit more from some of these productions.
And just finally, I would like to touch on the Marvel, and because I'm just looking at the time. Oh yeah, we've got heaps of time. Just on the Marvel and Netflix and all this movement that's happening from Nat Geo to Amazon, and they're all coming to live on Bundjalung territory. It's amazing. And I go, isn't it interesting? We always have in the budgets, the royalty, line. Wouldn't it be great if there was a line where it was just a small percentage of the budget that was dedicated to the local community for being on country? Wouldn't it be great is when you do your location shoot that it's actually someone from the industry with knowledge, knowing what you have to look for in a location, but comes from the local region. And I urge people to look in their local communities, because there are so many Aboriginal people who've gone off to the cities. They're skilled, they've gone to university, they've worked in the industry, and they come back home because their families need them. But no one in that community, in that working environment, looks at them to be regarded as employable. And on that note, one thing has shifted, which is very exciting, is, getting the call 2 days out. Oh, can you find a couple of dance groups, because we really want to do this Welcome to Country before we start shooting. Yeah, no problem. I'll just spend the rest of my day ringing around and finding the 2 dance groups. Oh, and could you add a Māori group in there, because we really want to do a call and response. Fantastic, and it was brilliant, and it worked really well. And that occurred that now, with the next 5 years that Marvel's here, every production, they'll have that opportunity of employing cultural ambassadors as well. But do you think that's a necessity on every film to have the local acknowledgement, the land acknowledgement, or a welcome to country, or a calling country?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I was talking to somebody recently who wants to start incorporating that kind of information just on production call sheets as they go out. I mean, those are very simple things, and putting in their end credits where it was shot, or if it was a national show and it was shot in several places, and it's hard to have and everyone's already fighting over end credits as it is most days, but so to add other things is difficult. But maybe where the production company is based full time, how hard is it to acknowledge country, the country you're on, and how hard is it to add that to a call sheet? How hard is that to put that into your contracting? How hard is it to do a welcome to country on the first day of shoot? How hard is it to find local Indigenous First Nations people to employ? It's not rocket science, it's not difficult, and it really should just become a part of normal production practice from woe to go. And I think that I'm hoping that Rhoda's going to write up a bit of a framework for this for all of us. That's something that we can share nationally, and that would be a really great idea. But I think it's just the constant reminder of wherever you are, you're on First Nations lands. Wherever you are, you're on lands that probably were stolen. And to continually to acknowledge and know wherever you go that you should know the First Nations name for that place is not rocket science, and it's not too hard. And certainly I think that that's something that we should incorporate into all productions, and not just the big international ones that are coming into town like the Marvels. Taika was a game changer. When he did the first Thor at the Gold Coast, he contacted Pauline Clegg, who contacted me, and he just said, I want to employ First Nations people throughout this whole thing. I'm a Māori man. I do not feel comfortable being in this country if I'm not surrounded by other First Nations people. So not only were we able to get 8 attachments across Thor, but he hired, I think it was something like close to 30 First Nations people from, you know, from unit managers to drivers to whatever it was. And since that, you're right, Marvel does it. Other productions that are coming to town are doing it, and it's a really new way to do things. And I think it's very exciting. Funny that it takes a man to come from overseas to start this trend for us.
And just on that note, and then we'll go to questions, cultural observance. When you're working with Aboriginal groups, it's just really important because there are many, obligations that you have to, as an individual from your community. And just because someone is successful doesn't mean, so many times I hear, oh, that's great, but we need to go talk to the grassroots person because then we're talking to the real Aboriginal. We all come from community. Just because we're successful doesn't mean that those obligations have been cut. We have serious obligations to our communities. And often you might consult with someone in the community and not aware that they have to go and seek permission for various songs, for various imagery, for whatever it is. And if you disregard that, and you'll move on, no matter what, they're still held responsible for that material, and they have to live in that community for the rest of their lives. So need to really allow that there is cultural observance that still takes place, even if it's a contemporary work. And I just want to pay my respects to someone who actually suffered severely because of that cultural observance disregard. And that was the late Mr. Balang, Tommy Lewis, when he was making films and was that gorgeous man discovered in the airport, did the chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, and then he went on to make films. And he pleaded with the director that he could not use a particular Aboriginal artefact because in that particular country where he was making that film, it wasn't accepted to be heard by women. The director said to him, "You signed a contract, you're an actor, you will do what I tell you." On the cutting room floor, they put a song with that particular piece that was not the appropriate song, that again he had sought the permission of his custodians to have that. He arrives home and is ostracised by the senior lawmen from his community for 10 years. 10 years that he cannot live on country. 10 years that he can never play a first instrument. 10 years that he can never do his dance. And 10 years where he will have to do payback and make up time after that decade of punishment, where he has to learn the knowledge of his songs so that when he dies, he can go to his morning star. And no one in the industry understood that. No one knew, because in those days you didn't talk about those things. So people framed him and gave him a label and thought he was just a drunk. But he was self-medicating to cope with the disaster that had occurred in his life that he was held responsible for. And, you know, the more serious things have happened to other people. And so that's my greatest word of advice, is always ask the question. There's no wrong question, but make sure that when you are engaging with people, and particularly in areas where ceremony is still being practiced, that you have to be very, very observant so that individual doesn't cop punishment.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. I mean, I've made some, some docos and various other things, and there's people when I've gone to community and we've made some stuff very remotely or even regionally. And for the rest of my life, when I see these people that were in these documentaries, I'm going to have to buy them a beer until I die, and that's okay. That's my relationship. That's how we got the film. Don't worry, it wasn't just a beer. I didn't make them work for rations. I wouldn't do that. This isn't Bitter Springs from the 1950s. But, so there is a cultural obligation that Indigenous people have. And if you're working and then you have a consultant or you're collaborating, you should always be mindful of the work that's happening underneath the surface. And the obligation that occurs because of that. and those trusting relationships that sit squarely on the shoulders of First Nations people, because non-Indigenous filmmakers can come and go from the region. You can make the film, then you move on, you start developing your next film, you start developing your next TV series. But for First Nations people with each other, those relationships exist forever. And if there is anything that's messed up, like with Tommy, who couldn't go back to Nooka for 10 years, and that sits solely with us. And so that needs to be recognised. It needs to be also paid for, this kind of expertise. A really prolific writer sent me an email last week because someone wanted to read her script, to do like script editing notes, really, as a reader, to give it an Indigenous pass. And I think they offered her like $220. And it's like,
she was actually getting paid.
yeah, well, yeah, $220, which is less than a note taker gets as a daily rate in a story room for a TV drama. You know, it's working for rations. There was no respect at all. This happens regularly, and people need to be very mindful of that. And in your development budgets, or you may just have an Indigenous character. It might not even be an Indigenous story with major Indigenous themes. But if you are going to get your script passed by someone, if you're going to do all of these kind of things, you pay for expertise, and you should do that. And so be very mindful of that. And we're going to be talking with the Writers Guild about kind of setting those rates appropriately moving into the future. So there's lots of great conversations happening. But it's not all doom and gloom, you know, like First Nation stories are extremely exciting. Lots of people want to be a part of them. There's great collaborations moving forward, international collaborations moving forward. And also, you know, being at Screen Australia for 6.5 years, I'm really excited about also the emergence of all these other underrepresented groups that are coming through as well. And those really exciting stories are going to be told. But I'm so fearful that they are getting the same kind of rape and pillage of their stories that we did 20 years ago, you know, where you've got these amazing, you know, like Pan-Asian Australian stories coming through. And, you know, you look in the writer's room and there's like one person from that represented background, and all the rest of the writers are, you know, and not from that represented group. So people need to be mindful of these changes taking place. People need to be mindful about the politics of representation when it comes to telling stories, particularly stories like we're going to see stories from groups in Australia where we've never seen them on screen before. You know, like there's recently a series with Filipino Australians. We haven't seen that before. There's going to be other series with other cultural groups. How important is it that they're done properly for the very first time? So you get a real, authentic point of view of that story, and something that just hasn't been kind of whitewashed and done properly and grown authentically. So it's a very exciting time, lots of great collaborations. What do we say? It's very buoyant. If you can get a crew to shoot something these days, it's pretty hard.
And a boat, you'll be right. No.
Yeah, you'll be right, exactly. But we made it through the floods, we're fine.
Oh, look, thank you, Penny. And look, can I just say thank you to everyone being in this room and listening at home, because it shows that you are invested, that you want to have a relationship with us. And that is heartfelt, you know, because at the end of the day, it's all our stories. They are interconnected on this vast ancient land that we call home. And the only difference is you have a lounge room, but my lounge room is sitting watching my mountain, and it's home. And we want you to be part of that home, but like you would if you visited your grandmother. You give her great respect, deep love, but you knock on a door before you enter her house, or you ring. So let's take that approach, because there is an incredible future for us all. And the amazing Ken Crouch has got some questions from the audience.
Well, actually, we don't have any questions yet on the Slido, so I'm just going to do a quick mention of making sure that you go to slido.com or download the app and actually use the code that's actually up on the screen. Or for those at home, it's R for regional, 2 the number 2, then G for global, F for screen, and F for forum. But I do have a question, though.
Certainly.
And I'd love to hear from Penny. I suppose we've had a number of conversations, and you're also going to be leaving the Screen Australia very soon. What is the one big thing that you would love people to take away from your legacy that you will be leaving behind, but also even stuff that you've talked about today? What are some of the most important things that you would like people in the audience or the viewers to really take away as the take-home message?
Look, I'm not sure, but I feel weird about the word legacy, or my friend Nush says all the time, don't use the word legacy, Penny. But look, for me, I'm really inspired by a huge group of new filmmakers. I won't say younger because I'm not ageist either, but a whole new crop of new filmmakers coming through that are telling such amazing stories. You know, they want to do vampire films that incorporate Indigenous characters. They want to do, you know, we're about to see a whole new wave of Indigenous storytelling like you've never seen before, literally. They are excited. We've created pathways for them, and I'm very excited about where they're going to go. The industry is safe with these new filmmakers coming through. They need help, facilitation and financing, but they need some non-Indigenous filmmakers to step aside and allow them to be the ones that will bring these stories through next. You know, we need space. We need to tell these stories. We need great mentors. We need great relationships, but we don't want to be a consultant on a First Nations film being made by a non-Indigenous person. You know, we want to tell our own stories. So at the end of the day, while I know in your heart of hearts you've got this First Nation story and, you know, you're so excited about it, the takeaway is, could a First Nations person tell this story better? My feeling is they probably could. And can you help facilitate and provide that opportunity? My feeling is you probably could.
Excellent, thank you. Now, we still don't have any questions, so we're going to be looking into the app. But is there any questions from the audience? I can actually pull the microphone off. Hopefully the audio guy won't get upset with me. And ask any questions, and I can shout it out. Mark, do you want to even just project your voice?
Leaving aside working on Indigenous projects, Indigenous writers, for example, in a writers' room, increasing demands for diversity, which is why the popular writers' rooms are more reflective of the stories and shows we're telling. Finding that talent can be tricky, and there's not a critical mass of it yet. So I'm so interested in your thoughts about what place for mentorship and what place for Indigenous writers, for example, and other creatives, on non-Indigenous stories.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's a great question as well, because we don't want to just be, you know, pigeonholed. You know, I know First Nations filmmakers that want to tell First Nation stories, but just want to work. They want to build craft, they want opportunities, and story rooms are such an amazing place in which to do that. You know, whether they're just there to brainstorming or note-taking to begin with, and then they're actually given the opportunity to maybe co-develop or co-write a script, I think is great. I don't think we should bring people, diversity hires into a story room without a longevity and bring them for the whole journey as well. They're not just there for their cultural knowledge, but they're there to actually learn and be a part of the process and building craft. How do you find people beyond going to like AFTRS and VCA and the various other schools and areas? Within Screen Australia, we have been talking about putting together a really comprehensive consultants list as really a comprehensive kind of emerging practitioner list. Some of this work has started to be done at places like ICE in Western Sydney, Footscray. There's lots of other like sort of localised organisations. Screenworks has a list of emerging people coming through. So there's definitely room to bring those people in and engage them in the whole process. You know, some of our best writers started 20 years, 30 years ago writing on Home and Away. They can knock out 1 hour of drama like there's no tomorrow. We need time to build craft to be at that level. And so any opportunities that you can bring in people from diverse backgrounds into story rooms and for the whole journey is amazing. And I think people are open to it. For the cultural kind of safety of a story room, I always recommend having more than one First Nations person in there, more than one Chinese Australian, more than one Indian Australian, that allows to have two people to bounce off each other, that allows two people to have a common vibe. And never say, some people, I heard this horrible story a couple of weeks ago where a young First Nations person was brought into a story room, her first story room, super excited, and she was introduced as being someone there that was there because she's First Nations and she has access to Dreamtime stories. And everybody else was introduced. This person's amazing. He's a great genre writer, and this person's got 25 years of experience and has written on this, that, and the other. And she gets introduced as, you're here because you're First Nations and you've got access to, Dreamtime stories. So there is a lot of those things that happen in this kind of situation of people wanting to do the right thing. There are best intentions. People want inclusive story rooms. They want inclusive characters on their TV shows, and they know in order to do that authentically, they need people from those backgrounds in those story rooms. And they are going to be less experienced, and they're not going to be able to write an hour of television drama straight off the cuff like that. But if they can be mentored over time by a really great story producer or a lead writer, I've seen people like, Cody Bedford's career has just gone through the roof, and she started by being a note taker in lots of story rooms, then brainstorming in lots of story rooms, and then was given an opportunity to write 1 hour for the first series of Mystery Road. So, it can be done, and that's how you create great writers and great opportunities. And watch this space in terms of Screen Australia trying to build a more kind of cohesive list that we could start to send out to people for better collaborations. Because we see that people don't know where to begin to find these people, and they want to do it properly, and they want to provide great opportunities. So that is something that we're going to be working on, definitely.
Excellent. We've also had some questions come through now, which is great. It's working, yay. So I've got a question here from Katie Tonkin, who is a local emerging practitioner that we're supporting, and she'd like to know, what advice would you give an emerging Indigenous filmmaker?
Look, I hope you're resilient. It's a hard industry to be in. I think that one big thing that I've learned and observed is that when it comes to people think that becoming a consultant on somebody else's film is a really good entry point into the industry. I've heard other writers like Nikki Aiken and others say their entry point into the industry was writing. They wrote scripts on spec, they made up scripts and had script samples that got them into story rooms and got them in. That was more of an opportunity to make your way into this industry than being a consultant on somebody else's film. So for someone making it through is to do whatever, if she's a writer, continue to write, do all the courses that are available to you. Afters, has great short courses. You run great short courses. Subscribe, of course, to every website. You should be subscribing to Screen Australia, your local state agency, Australians in Film for looking at international opportunities. You should be informed of the industry at all times. And where possible, come to these kind of networking events. These are great opportunities because people are always contacting me for names and lists. And when everyone in this room knows people, we'll always be trying to connect and network people. And don't give up, because it is a very hard game.
Yep, I completely agree. It's a very hard game, and to just keep on going. Thanks, Katie. Another question that we've got here is, if there was a story that they wanted to tell about First Nations, but know that there was someone more suited to tell that story, what would be your advice about how to go about that?
So in terms of they have a great story and they...
Yeah, there's a story that they wanted to tell, which is a First Nation story, but they know that there's someone actually better suited to actually telling that story.
Well, I mean, I think the simple thing is to, if they know that person, is to go straight to them and sort of say, are you aware of this story? Have you ever heard of this character? Do you know anything about this? This might be something that's of interest for you. I mean, it all starts with a conversation, really, and it's pretty straightforward in that regard. I mean, it could be a collaborative, joint kind of venture where it's like, can I facilitate you, or can I work with you, or can I co-produce this with you? It just has to start with a conversation, I think.
Yeah. And we might just do one more question. So this actually relates to the American market, so really going global. And how would you explain to the American market that there is a difference between First Nation and African American history and how it might not be comparable? I'm just doing some rewording here. And do we need to collaborate more with the American market? I believe the question is.
All roads lead to Hollywood, without a doubt. Look, the Screen Australia doesn't have infinite funding resources. To get the big projects up, you will need international financing. And whether that comes out of the American market or all three, or wherever it's European kind of finances, you're going to need it to make international relationships for very big projects, very big films, very big scripted series. You're going to need to sort of pitch to those areas to be able to get up those big projects. I think with the African American comparison with the First Nations thing is, we are black, we are people of colour, but we have had very different histories and lived experiences, probably have more commonalities with Native Americans than we do with African Americans. But that's not to say there isn't some kind of growing collaborations. When I was in LA, I had an amazing meeting with a company called Macro Entertainment. And they've just done Judas and the Messiah. They're an African American company that's actually very interested in working with First Nations Australian directors on their TV shows. So there is some great opportunities there. Australians in Film is a great place to become a member of. Peter Ritchie, I just love him to death. He runs Australians in Film. He provides his knowledge and networks of the US market are prolific, and so I would definitely recommend becoming a member of Australians in Film. There's great masterclasses, great initiatives to find international show running mentorships. They just did a big call out for something called Untapped, and they've got, Taika Waititi and, Warwick Thornton and some other fantastic international showrunners that are going to mentor people through. This was aimed at underrepresented groups, 700 applications for what is going to be an opportunity for 6 people at the end of the day. So, I mean, that's the market, but, it's scary, but it's also very exciting that there are so many people from underrepresented groups here in Australia that want to tell screen stories, that would apply to find international mentoring opportunities to take their stories further afield. So, we're in a global market right now. Global financing structures are very important, those relationships. But we've also got people on the ground now. Netflix has a team here on the ground, Q, who's speaking at this conference as well. I've seen advertised Amazon is going to have someone on the ground here soon. People are starting to get calls from Apple right now. So there's the streamers are coming to town. I think the streamers all feel that Australia and New Zealand is an important territory to them, even though we don't have a huge population. Yes, there'll always be times where you need to go further afield to market or find financing for your film, but people are coming to town now, and you can get local people on the ground. So that is very, very exciting for us all.
Thank you so much, Penny. And also I want to acknowledge Australians in Film and what they're doing over in Hollywood as well. I think we're partners with Australians in Film, and for any members you can get reciprocal membership as part of your ScreenWorks membership, so please look into that. But please join me in thanking both Penny Smallacombe and Rhoda Roberts here today.
Thanks, Rhoda.
Thank you.